Okay, thank you for joining us this morning. Today, we're going to talk about Bitcoin and renewable energy with Daniel Batten. We're going to give this a second go because, big brain me, I forgot to record the first conversation that we had. I have made sure to record this, so it will be easy to re-listen to and share later on. Hey, today I've got a novel announcement because this Spaces is finally, I've got a sponsor to support me. Relay app is the easiest way to buy Bitcoin in Europe. No verification or registration needed. You just buy Bitcoin directly into your own private wallet. So Relay app, check them out. Daniel, welcome back. Thank you so much for making time again to have this conversation with me. I don't know what I was
Thanks,
doing.
Archie.
Yeah, so Daniel joins us from New Zealand, and last time around he was so kind and generous enough to wake up at the early hour of 6 o'clock to join me. And what do? I don't record the conversation. So my apologies to you, Daniel. It was I don't know what I was thinking, actually. It's just a huge error. But thanks again.
We'll call it a dress rehearsal. This one's going to be even better, right?
No, I hope so. Isn't that the way it goes?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So, hey, thanks again for joining us. This time it's our morning, your evening. I hope you haven't had too long a day and you're not feeling too drained or sleepy. So let's get right into it. There's been a lot of talk, and I guess some people would call it an attack vector to Bitcoin from the mainstream, particularly from vested interests that, first of all, hey, Bitcoin consumes an enormous amount of energy. What does that actually mean? Is Bitcoin a legitimate use of energy, and how do we make that case at the very start before we get into everything else?
Yeah, look, I think there's a number of people who have really made an excellent case for it being a legitimate use of energy, and I'd recommend anyone here to follow Alex Gladstein's work. He's written an excellent book. I think it's called Check Your Privilege Level. Basically, what he says is that if you're coming across with this viewpoint, oh, but Bitcoin doesn't do anything useful, it's really only possible to say that if you come from the West, you are part of a democratic state, non-authoritarian, and you have good financial rails that you depend on throughout your life, and you've never imagined that 3/4 of the world, that's not their reality. They live in an authoritarian state or a partially authoritarian state, where if you say something against the government, you could have your assets frozen like that. And of course, as we're discovering, that can even happen in a Western country as well, but happens more regularly in other parts of the world. And if you're in somewhere like Africa, there are no financial rails for the most part. There is no banking system. And there's the vestige of an old colonial system, which has a number of disadvantages at a state level. And so for a lot of these nations and a lot of the people in the nations, Bitcoin really legitimately does mean freedom. This is why we've seen Colombia's new MP, a socialist, prime minister, coming out and saying, we like Bitcoin because it gives us power over the banks and over the bankers. So whether you're looking at women in Afghanistan that can't be discriminated against because they can be paid, where you're not allowed to set up a bank account at the moment if you're a woman in Afghanistan, whether you're looking at someone in Nigeria with 2/3 the population of the US, all of whom live under fear of if they say the wrong thing, there could be some negative consequences. They could lose their assets, they could be frozen, and this regularly happens. And Bitcoin is offering them freedom. It's an apolitical structure, as we know. And there's a number of huge advantages to people who live outside that Western system. So it's unquestionable its value to the world. And then in terms of this thing about, well, surprise, surprise, Bitcoin, like every other industry in the world, uses energy, like solar energy does, and like wind production does. They all use energy too. And so it's actually quite amusing that because it's such a flimsy narrative to criticize an asset or a technology for using energy, because we have to look at the true accounting. And like anything, you want to look at the liabilities, you want to look at the assets, you want to look at, okay, it uses energy, what does it do that's useful? And it turns out what it does that's useful is not just as a tool for the world's financial rails, but it has a tremendous, and I would say completely accidental, environmental use case as well, which for me, is at least as exciting as its financial use case.
Really interesting point that you made, because a lot of the people who are listening to this right now, and also perhaps most of the mainstream, we live in societies, as you have described, as high trust societies. So when I look at Bitcoin adoption, which is one of the main themes of my Twitter account, the consensus is that regulation will foster trust in Bitcoin and thus encourage mass adoption of Bitcoin. But in other parts of the world where there is a low trust environment in government institutions and other centers of power, it's actually quite the opposite. Bitcoin seems to be a shelter from those centers of power that expropriate their assets and their wealth, either through hyperinflationary policies or outright theft and seizure, as you've described. So it's really interesting. That dichotomy seems to be counterintuitive, because most people don't have access to understanding that experience of people living in other parts of the world that are highly unstable, both politically, economically, socially, perhaps in any other metric you want to use as well. So that's a really interesting point that you made. Next thing is, I guess, they say, well, why don't you just use proof of stake? Proof of work is so unnecessary and highly energy intensive. What would you say to that?
Well, there's a couple of things I'd say to that. It turns out that if you want to build out the renewable grid, you better hope there's as many cryptocurrencies in the world that are using proof of work, not proof of stake, but we'll come to that later on. But just addressing it at a simple governance level, so Lynn Alden has really unpacked the difference very eloquently, and a summary of what she says on the subject is very simple, which is proof of work means that you have a system which cannot be corrupted. And remember that Bitcoin was created in response to corruption, in response to lax standards between regulators and central bankers, and people not acting in the best interests of the economy and of society. And it was for that reason, and all that money printing that went on, that Satoshi decided on a better protocol called Bitcoin. And so we have this incredible system that was created, and part of why proof of work was used is that it was uncorruptible. It was based on a peer-to-peer network. And the moment you have something called proof of stake, then it more similarly looks like an equity. It looks like a governance structure, where the more stake you have, the more ability to have say you have. And if we look at I think it was 2017, when there was a group of miners who got together and they suggested the block wars, and they suggested that the block size increased, which would have been good for exchanges but bad for most miners, and bad for really the peer-to-peer and for the people, by the people nature of Bitcoin. Had that been proof of stake at that time, then because they owned most of the hash power, they would have had the power to change, to enforce that change, because they had a majority. But because it was proof of work, highly decentralized, not a governance structure based on how much of a stake you had, then it did not. And so what happened was a group of people said, well, we're going to create our own branch of the Bitcoin source code. And they did, and it's called Bitcoin Cash. And you don't hear so much about Bitcoin Cash because it proceeded to devalue by a factor of 100 relative to the price of Bitcoin. Went down by 10x, Bitcoin went up by 10x. People didn't adopt it. They didn't use the source code. Bitcoiners did not want a system which was based on something which was corruptible. So the thing we have to understand is that the moment you move away from proof of work, you actually move away from everything that Bitcoin represents and everything it was built to solve. You've now got just another movement, started off with a lot of hope, and then got corrupted into something which had just the same inadequacies as the thing it was trying to replace in the first place. In other words, it would be a failed revolution.
So we've started off talking about the properties of Bitcoin, in particular proof of work, and how proof of stake essentially mirrors, it's almost like a digital version of the existing system. And we see that when the Reserve Bank or Federal Reserve, whichever country you live in, whatever it's called, the central bank of your country prints money, who does it go to? It goes essentially to people who have already got the money. Power centers, rich people, corporations, banks, and essentially it still goes through the hierarchy within our socioeconomic structures, and the people who get it last are the people who, by the time the average working person gets any kind of increase in their salary, inflation has already hit their pockets. And so, asset prices have risen, the cost of goods and services have risen. They really don't get any of the benefits of that at all. And hence, if anyone has been listening to Max and Stacey's show, they've been going on about the Cantillon effect for years. And this is effectively how it plays out. So proof of work is an essential component of Bitcoin. You can say the essential component of Bitcoin. And it makes all the other properties of Bitcoin, like scarcity, 21 million forever, and all the rest of that, possible, and how we can actually have confidence that will persist. So we've established, first of all, proof of work and Bitcoin, they are legitimate uses of energy. So I guess what I want to move on from there is energy consumption, source of energy, and how the consumption of energy through Bitcoin mining can facilitate the adoption of renewables. Can you take us through the process of that? Because what a lot of people don't understand is you are also an investor in ESG technology. So
Correct.
perhaps with that framework in mind, you can walk us through that and how you think about it from an investment point of view and how it will actually play out to increase renewable energy adoption.
Yes, so there's four really important points, and I'll go through them just at a very summarized level. So the first one to understand is that most of Bitcoin's energy use is coming from renewable sources already. In fact, according to the Bitcoin Mining Council, it's almost up to 60%. It's 58% is renewable, and that is ahead of any other technology in the world today. So it's the number one user of renewable energy as a technology. So that's exceptional, and it's achieved that in just 12 years. That's the first thing. The second thing to understand about Bitcoin is sometimes you look at this energy usage and you think, wow, that's really high. Well, that presupposes that you're taking energy away from someone else who would have used it. And that's increasingly not the case with Bitcoin. Most of that energy and increasing amounts of the energy Bitcoin is using is energy that would otherwise have been wasted, either because it would have been curtailed, it would have been coming from a wind source or a solar source at a time of day where it was overproducing energy that no one could use because it was being used at midday and there wasn't demand, and Bitcoin miners are taking that energy, or because they have found stranded sources of energy, such as flared gas in the form of methane leaching into the atmosphere. We can talk later on about how bad that is. And they're converting it, they're burning that in generators and using that as a source of fuel to produce electricity. So it's not depriving anyone of energy. It's environmentally neutral, and in some cases actually extremely environmentally positive if you're burning methane. So that's the second thing to understand about its energy usage.
So can I just interrupt you there and just
Yeah.
make one point? And I guess the point Daniel is making is that Bitcoin mining operations are location agnostic. They can be located anywhere the energy source actually is. So stranded energy sources that are not stranded in the sense that they're not close to industrial processes and can't be easily transported or economically transported to such locations. And Bitcoin miners can actually be co-located at the same place as that stranded energy source, whether it's a stream, a waterfall, flared gas that would otherwise be put into the atmosphere. All a Bitcoin miner needs is a method to connect to the internet in order to monetize that stranded energy source. So I just wanted to make that point and clarify that.
Yeah. And look, as an investor, as you say, I didn't come at this as a Bitcoin evangelist looking for reasons to justify its environmental use case. I came at this as an investor just fascinated with and looking at technologies that can make a meaningful difference to the environment. And as an investor, of course, you're curious and you're taught not to trust what you hear. You hear a great pitch from an entrepreneur and you think, okay, that sounds great. Let me do the due diligence. And so when you hear a narrative on anything, including Bitcoin, you say, okay, well, that's interesting. Let me do my own due diligence. So we just did our own due diligence on Bitcoin mining. And what we found out was that the real story of Bitcoin, once you do the research, is 180 degrees different from what you hear in the mainstream media. Not even close. I would describe it as the most exciting technology for the acceleration of the renewable grid and for the environment and for reversing climate change that has come into existence in the last 20 years. That's how incredible its use case is. And it just astounds me that this is all completely accidental. It wasn't the reason that Bitcoin was designed. It's this accidental use case that comes out of the particular unique, as you say, location agnostic and time of day agnostic features of Bitcoin and the totally interruptible nature of it. Most users in the world they want to use power when they want to use it. And that's at certain times of day. And they want to use power where they want to use it. And they can't be interrupted. You can't interrupt a data center or a coal plant or someone who's producing steel very easily, at least not for a long period of time, or a hospital. People will die. But Bitcoin proof of work mining is completely interruptible. You can do it anywhere. And you can shut miners off. You can be doing it day and night. So it's very flexible. I was literally talking to a group of Bitcoin miners 2 days ago, and they told me that they had just partnered up with a large utility scale wind operation. And it took the wind operators took them a little while to get the usefulness of Bitcoin mining. But when they got it, they said, never in my wildest dreams would I have imagined such a perfect customer. So what you're saying is absolutely right, and that has some very unique advantages.
Okay, so
So
I want to let's go into that a little bit more, because what you said is a very big statement, and it strikes a lot of people as being counterintuitive. How can something that consumes energy be good for the environment? So perhaps you can talk us a little bit about how the business case stacks up and what Bitcoin mining actually adds to the business case to make that.
yeah.
Yeah, go ahead. You know what I'm getting at.
I do. And it's incredibly counterintuitive. I agree.
Yeah.
And look, I'll be honest, when I first looked at that argument and I heard people saying Bitcoin's good for the environment, I was like, come on, you're kidding me, that you're just trying to justify an asset which you want to do well. And so I had that initial reaction. And fortunately, I was encouraged to look at it deeper, and I did. It's very counterintuitive. So look, I'll walk through how it works then. So the first thing is that any technology, so solar is another example, uses a huge amount of energy in the production of the value that it creates. So solar, for example, the solar panels don't just get taken out of the earth, they have to be created. In the creation of silicon, the melting point is over 1400 degrees Celsius. And how does that melting occur? It occurs in furnaces, and guess what? They're fueled with coal. And so there's always energy used with the creation of any asset that has value, even if it has a net environmental positive effect. But we don't have a problem with solar energy because we say, yeah, that's true, but look at all the good that it does, and that's absolutely true. So we say, yes, it has a negative because we have to use some energy to create the solar panels. But after a year and a half, 2 years, it's paid off its energy debt, it's paid off its carbon debt, and the other 20, 25 or more years is just pure energy credit because it's displacing solar energy. So that's a net environmental positive. We get that. And so what we have to do is shift our thinking and use that framework to think about any technology, including Bitcoin. So we have to go, yes, like solar, it requires some energy to create the asset. Now let's look at the other side of the equation, which is let's look at the good that it does. And so when we look at the good that it does, we can look at two areas, and we're concentrating on the grid and renewables at the moment. So then we go, okay, let's look at what's required to build out this grid, and probably the single most important infrastructure transition of a generation, which is the transition of our grid from something which is predominantly fossil fuel based to something which is predominantly renewable based. And when I say renewable, I don't just mean hydro, I mean variable renewable based. In other words, based on solar and wind. That introduces some major problems to the grid. And one of the problems we've talked about, which is what happens when the sun doesn't shine or the wind doesn't blow. What happens when you've got most of the solar energy coming in the middle of the day, but most people want to use that energy at 6 o'clock at night? Well, what do you do? How do you balance that load? It causes massive imbalances in the grid. And the other problem you talked about, which is location, what happens, for example, if you've got some wind farm in the north of Germany? Because a lot of the wind is going to be at the coast, but then that's not where your major population centre is. And what happens if it's a really windy day and suddenly you want to transmit all that power down the transmission lines, but you can't because it gets congested, just like a highway gets congested. That energy goes into the ground. And so a lot of the energy that's being produced by these renewables right now is getting lost, is getting wasted because it's at the wrong time of day or it's the wrong part of the country. And so what that means is that this compromises the profitability of renewables massively. Second problem is that the grid operators are looking at this. They're going from a stable base load of fossil fuels, which are bad for the environment, but at least they take a headache away from the grid operators, which is they can ramp them up and ramp them down where they need to according to demand. You can't ramp up and ramp down the sun. You can't move a cloud because you need more energy. You can't just get creating more wind out of thin air. You're totally vulnerable to what they want to produce. So it introduces major headaches. And so now what's happening is these grid operators are saying, we have major problems balancing supply and demand, the more renewables that come on. And so the only way that they can start to respond to that is, well, there's two ways. Way number one is that when everyone turns on their electricity at 6 o'clock at night, and suddenly the sun's getting less, you get less supply of renewable, but more demand, they say, right, we've got to crank up that coal station, or we've got to crank up, normally it's a gas turbine. And so they crank up that gas turbine. So you see the problem here? We haven't actually transitioned to renewables at all because we still need fossil fuel for when there's peak demand. But it's worse than that. See, that gas turbine hasn't just been sitting there cold. In order to have the capacity to ramp up fast, it's had to be kept warm. It's had to be idling. So it's going 24/7 idling, burning fossil fuels just for that 1% of the year where suddenly everyone goes on the grid at once. Now, if you have Bitcoin mining, you don't need that gas turbine anymore, because what you can do is, rather than the grid operator having to fire up the gas turbine and increase the supply, they can decrease the demand. They can contact the Bitcoin miners and say, hey, we're reaching high usage. We're in danger of blackouts. Can you please power down your Bitcoin mining? And they'll say, yes, we can. And they power down. Gas turbine hasn't needed to come online. It's good for the grid, good for the environment, good for users, keeps the grid stable, and everyone's happy.
So this is not just an idea; it's actually in practice.
This is happening. This is not theory. This is actually happening right now. And in fact, this happened in Texas recently. I think a lot of us will remember what happened in 2021 when there were rolling blackouts and billions of dollars of damage, including hundreds of losses of lives when through some of those blackouts. And then the following year, where they had storms that were also incredibly severe, they did not have rolling blackouts. And there was a Network News article which said that one of the chief reasons for that was that now they had those Bitcoin miners, they had those agreements in place, and when they hit that peak demand and everyone was trying to warm themselves up during those winter storms, the Bitcoin miners powered down and they helped to stabilize the network. This is happening right now. This is not theory.
So this is as much a cooperation out of goodwill, but also embedded into contracts as well. So the grid actually has the right to tell Bitcoin miners as part of their contractual agreement, hey, we need you to power down. There is a small compensation factor in that, but in the net, it washes up to be positive both for the grid, the Bitcoin miner, society, because Bitcoin mining essentially allows for the overinvestment or investment beyond what would otherwise be justified through ordinary use without Bitcoin mining energy consumption.
Yeah. And in the whole process, what's happened is you don't need those what are called peaker plants anymore. A lot of people in the world saying let's phase out peaker plants by 2030. That's the right intention. That's the right strategy, but how do you execute that strategy? The only way you can execute that strategy is if you have an alternative strategy. Either you've got to have some other plant maybe you build a whole lot of nuclear or a whole lot of hydro. That's going to take a lot of time. It's going to take a lot of carbon footprint to do that. It's going to take a lot of money. Or you just have some users that can power down much cheaper, much more immediate, and stabilizes the grid instantly.
Wow. So that's only just one aspect of it, but it's
That's only just
extraordinary
getting started.
Yeah. And
it's only just getting started.
Yeah. So through supply or demand management, what do you call it? Responsive demand management or something like that. What was that
demand
term
response.
that you used? Yeah, that's it.
Demand response.
Yeah. That was really insightful. The last time we had a chat, you mentioned that essentially, if you take the average of what the society would consume and what can be justified through investment into renewables, and then you take the peaks and the troughs, add Bitcoin mining to that to be able to adjust to it, it effectively means that we could, I don't want to use the term overinvest, but invest and develop renewables beyond what would normally be justifiable through organic demand.
Absolutely. What the experts are saying is that if we really want to build out this renewable grid, which is actually essential if we want to avoid climate catastrophe, we have no choice. We have got to do it. And in order to do that, what the experts are saying is that we have to increase our demand response from about 1% up to 50%. And so then grid operators are looking and say, well, who can we turn on to do demand response? And historically, they've looked at steel mills and they said, well, can you shut off? And they say, yeah, we can for a little bit, but we can't shut off for too long because our steel's going to harden and we're going to lose a lot of money. Bitcoiners, they can shut off for as long as they want. And so when you have to have 50% of users or 50% demand response, where is that going to come from? And literally, the most perfect customer, the most flexible customer is Bitcoin miners by an order of magnitude. So this is absolutely required. Now, some people say, well, you can do it with batteries. We can just store that electricity. Battery solves the problem. Batteries by itself does not solve the problem.
Can you tell us why? Why doesn't that? Because, I guess intuitively I would say, go ahead.
Yeah, a few reasons. So number one, batteries are really expensive. And I understand that the price is decreasing exponentially. There's also 3 very rare metals in them, cobalt and nickel and one other I forget offhand, that are in limited supply. And the other thing is that a lot of those batteries are going straight into Tesla cars and other EVs right now. So there's contention for resources. But the bigger problem is that once a battery's full, it's full. You can't keep on charging it. And there's a bigger problem again, which is it's just not great economics. It exposes you to massive risk. Because when you have a battery, you're choosing to put some of your surplus capacity into that battery. And then, of course, you want to discharge that as soon as possible so you can reuse that battery. But what if at the time you discharge it, the wholesale electricity prices, because they vary, unlike retail electricity prices, they can go anywhere from negative pricing right up to hundreds of dollars per kilowatt hour at ridiculous demand levels. But what happens if the prices are negative or the prices is 1 cent per kilowatt hour? Then you're going to lose money if you discharge it back to the grid at that price. But if you have a Bitcoin mining operation, you can say, hey, well, I can get 5 cents per kilowatt hour by selling it, or 4 cents, or whatever you've decided on your power purchase agreement, and you get 5 times as much. So you can do arbitrage. You can make continuous decisions about when to charge up your battery, when to use it for Bitcoin mining, and then when you're discharging your battery, do you use that battery energy for Bitcoin mining, or do you sell it back to the grid? And you can become upwards of 20% more profitable simply by making better choices.
Wow.
So Bitcoin mining plus battery together is the solution. Batteries by itself is not going to solve these issues.
So we spoke about renewables. Can you tell us a little bit about methane gas, its effect on the environment, and how Bitcoin mining can help there?
I can. There's just one more thing I've got to tell you about renewables.
Go ahead.
Can I tell you that too? This is super important. This is the thing I get most excited about. And at the moment, you know what the biggest bottleneck is to the building out of the renewable grid? It's actually that there are massive queues trying to get new renewable operations built. So in the US right now, for example, there's upwards of $2 trillion of infrastructure that could be built in the renewable energy area, but it's getting queued up by more than 3-4 years. In the US and the UK, sometimes up to 10 years of queues getting on. And the reason of these queues is that the grid operators are, well, how would you feel if suddenly you've got all this renewable coming on and you've got this headache of how you balance the load, how you keep your grid stable? And so when you suddenly have a renewable operator who has a Bitcoin mining operation that can help with stabilizing the grid, it becomes much more attractive to the grid operators to say yes to. But the other thing is, a lot of these operations, they're not even getting financed. And as an investor, of course, we understand exactly why they're not getting financed. And that's because they're going to investors and they're saying, hey, we want to set up this wind farm. The investor says, fantastic. You got any customers? Well, no, but we'll have some customers once we get onto the grid. And they say, how long is that going to take? And they say, well, 2 years. And the investor does the due diligence, say, no, it's not. It's going to take 4 years. That's 4 years before you get any return on investment. In the meantime, you're just getting, you build all the capital. You're sitting there waiting and hoping you get onto the grid. That's not an attractive investment. But when the renewable operator comes and they have a Bitcoin miner who is working with them in tandem, number one, they've got a first customer who's paying them money before they even get on the grid. That immediately has taken about half the risk to an investor off the table. I can tell you we're much more likely to invest in a company who's got a customer paying them good money on a regular basis than one who has a great idea.
So Bitcoin mining can accelerate the investment in renewable energy by trillions of dollars.
Correct. It can speed it up. It can get it invested on. It can stop the grid operators from getting freaked out that you've got a whole lot of really potentially hard to load balance new sources of energy generation coming onto the grid. And it makes it more profitable so therefore incentivizing more people to want to come into solar and wind, more likely to get invested in and more likely to get onto the grid. So it declutters that bottleneck. And if we can remove that bottleneck, and I haven't seen a technology better placed than Bitcoin mining to remove that bottleneck, then we can potentially get the rate of renewable adoption back to what it was 10 years ago. It's actually slowed down. And if we can get it back to where it was 10 years ago, which is not 20% per year, but more than 40% per year, then we can build out a renewable component of the grid that could be as much as 70% by the year 2030. And that's massively above what we're scheduled for right now. That's how much of a difference it can make when you're doubling your compound annual growth rate of renewables. And Bitcoin mining is actually best placed to be able to do this.
So what's the urgency with that? You mentioned 2030. What's the target? What's the purpose of that target? And what's the urgency around that?
Well, the urgency really is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has said, we've only got till 2030 to sort out some of our major climate change issues. And if we haven't sorted them out by then we may have runaway climate change. So there's a huge amount of urgency around 2030. And that's now been the new target we've been given to solve some of these major problems. And we're not on target. We're off target on just about every measure possible. And so one of the things I get excited about with my environmental hat on is I'm looking around for solutions, and I'm looking around for where we have technology solutions. Of course, technology isn't the only way. There are many ways. Technology is one of the components to dealing with the climate crisis. So when I see a technology that can actually solve a real practical issue today, not in 10 years' time, but right now, that can have an impact this year and is having an impact, that can make a big difference by 2030, I get excited.
Wow, that's amazing. Let's move on to methane.
So methane, yes.
So I guess where do you want to start there? Because so Bitcoin mining can be used to burn off flared gas. Tell us why that's so important.
Yeah, so again, this is counterintuitive, right? Because you think burning gas, that doesn't sound good for the environment. I remember my basic chemistry. When you burn gas, it produces carbon dioxide, and we all know what that does. But again, there's a nuance, and the truth is in the nuance, and this is why you should not rely on the mainstream media as your source of truth, because it misses those nuances. And the very important nuance is this. When you're using natural gas that would otherwise have stayed in a gas pipeline or in the ground and you're burning it, that's carbon positive. That's bad for the environment. When you turn off on a gas stove, on a gas heater, that gas otherwise would not have been used, would not have gone into the atmosphere. We want to stop that. We want to swap them out for electrical versions of the same technology. So electrical heaters, etc. However, when that gas would not have stayed into the ground, when that gas would have gone into the air in the form of methane, burning it is carbon negative, and the reason's very simple. Methane, as a greenhouse gas, over a 20-year period of time, is 80 times more warming to the Earth than carbon dioxide. 80 times, 80, not 80% more, 80 times more potent. And what we found out just last year through NASA satellite surveys and the Environmental Defense Fund, who did surveys as well, over landfills and over flared gas fields, is that our methane emissions into the air are between 2 and 4 times higher than anyone had expected. And this is so devastating to us because methane is such a superheater. It's responsible for 25% of all climate change. And after that NASA satellite data and Environmental Defense Fund data was released, it had such an impact that the United Nations Environmental Programme revised its statement about methane. And they said, this is Inger Anderson, the executive director of the United Nations Environmental Programme, said, methane is our strongest lever, or reducing methane is our strongest lever to reduce climate change in the next 25 years. That's how important it is. So it's coming from landfills, where it gets released as a gas from the decaying organic matter that's decaying anaerobically, and it's going straight into the air in many cases, in most cases, and it's causing climate havoc. It comes from a lot of places. One of the other places is in the oil and gas field. When an oil company hits oil, they don't just hit oil, they hit natural gas as well. Most of that natural gas is methane. And unfortunately, most of those oil fields are too far away from a gas pipeline to be able to transport economically. So what do? Well, they burn it, they flare it. And that's why you've probably seen images of these flares around oil fields. That's what they're doing. They're just burning it. So they're wasting the energy. And you might think, well, that's okay. They're flaring it, so that's getting rid of the methane, turning into carbon dioxide, so that's not as bad. But the problem is it's inefficient. It doesn't burn all the methane. A lot of the methane still escapes. And that bit of the methane that still escapes, between 8 and 10% of it, is causing climate havoc. And so when you sum up the combined total from landfill methane emission and oil and gas methane emissions, then that's 41% of all human-caused methane from those two sources alone. That's huge. So if we can reduce that, we can actually have a significant effect on reducing the speed of climate change. In fact, here's one more figure from the United Nations Environmental Programme. They said that if we can reduce our methane emission levels by 45%, we can reduce 0.3 degrees Celsius of climate change. And that's huge in the context of how close we are to tipping over that 1.5 degree heating since pre-industrial times. We're pretty close to that right now, at 1.1%. So we've only got 0.4 degrees of wiggle room. And so 3/4 of that, we could buy some extra time and some extra space by reducing our methane emissions. And the report that I did recently says that Bitcoin mining, if we deploy it, and we are burning that oil and gas industry methane, and we're burning the landfill emissions, we have the potential to fulfill half of the entire United Nations Environmental Programme target of 45%. We can do half of that with Bitcoin mining alone.
It sounds to me like it's too good to be true. On the one hand, Bitcoin extends the runway for our ability to act and address climate change, but also on the second point, which is what you addressed earlier on, it helps us build the infrastructure. So it doesn't just help extend the runway, but it also facilitates the development of a future vision of renewable energy as well.
It's insane. It's insane for me to see that one technology could be used in two areas, both of which have such enormous potential environmentally. And so it's particularly when Bitcoin wasn't even invented, with these use cases in mind. So
Yeah.
we're standing looking at this ridiculous accident, and it gets even more funny when people are criticizing it for its being bad for the environment, which is even more funny. But the biggest laugh of all is it turns out that as a technology, it's going to be part of the story of what actually helps us to combat the major challenge of our time, which is climate change.
And it doesn't even take into consideration changing behaviors that might be fostered by, demonetizing gold, for example. Or we haven't gone into how environmentally destructive gold is. Perhaps that's for another time, and certain
Yeah.
other processes as well. So, whether or not it eventually changes consumer behaviors and encourages more saving and investment with a longer time
Yeah.
horizon rather than fast consumption habits with respect to fashion and other items as well. So we haven't even looked at the consumer behaviors that Bitcoin or Bitcoin Standard could potentially change as well. Now, putting that aside, just the two use cases that you've made with renewable energies and also flared methane gas, the case for Bitcoin being good for the environment seems overwhelmingly compelling to me.
Yeah.
And I think you've done a really good job of outlining that. So my mind goes to the next step is, why is it so fiercely resisted by environmentalists and people on the left of the political spectrum? And when we'll leave aside the mainstream media and vested interests for now, but
Yeah.
people who I would have imagined would be more receptive to these kinds of innovations and ideas seem to be reflexively, viscerally opposed, even to hearing out the ideas and arguments that you've just laid out now. And I'm really interested in understanding that better. And perhaps it might be an opportune time for me to just give a little hint to our audience that you originally come from a position of being an environmental activist. So perhaps if you could just share with us your personal journey and then lead into my question on how we can better convince people like yourself
Yeah.
prior to your enlightenment of Bitcoin benefits. So go ahead.
Yeah, so, well, first confession time. When I first heard of Bitcoin, I thought it was going to be terrible for the environment. I had the same visceral reaction that every other environmentalist that I know of had initially to Bitcoin, because I read some articles. It said it uses a lot of energy. It cited some research which said that some Bitcoiners were firing up an old fossil fuel plant, which turned out to be true. So there are some Bitcoin miners which are doing things which are not great for the environment as well. Fortunately, they're not only the minority, but they're going to quickly become unprofitable, because that's a really unprofitable way to mine Bitcoin. And the other thing that's happening right now is the unprofitable ones, they're all the ones using fossil fuel or the wrong sources of electricity. So it's actually going to get better. It's going to get cleaner. It's going to get greener as we go, because people have no choice. But to answer your question, why do people have this reaction? Well, I can tell you exactly why. It's the same reason I did. From my point of view of Western privilege, I had no idea about how useful it was outside my world. That was the first thing. So it looked for me just like a speculative asset. I thought it was a get rich quick scheme, and that the people were defending its energy usage because they had a vested interest in doing so, which was the user adoption and the price appreciation of Bitcoin. And they could see that if there were too many opponents, that could threaten that. So that was the reason they were defending it. But it was fundamentally indefensible. That was what I initially thought. And I probably would have been locked into that position for a long time had I not had a friend who really encouraged me just to look at it more deeply, because I would have been surrounded by a whole lot of other people and they would have said the same thing. And then we would have had groupthink occurring, which is we all reinforce each other's existing opinions, which had been fed by a mainstream media narrative. Now, what got me curious, though, was when I saw a video by Andreas Antonopoulos, who was talking about how it could incentivize the renewable build out of the grid. And he talked about some of these things that I'm talking about now. So these ideas are not new. I'm simply trying to be a mouthpiece for what people have identified over a long time and put them together in a coherent way that makes sense to people encountering them for the first time. And when I heard that argument, I thought, well, that sounds possible, but maybe it's just a justification or a rationalization. It didn't, like you said, I had this objection, which is, how can something that consumes so much electricity be good for the environment? And so the thing about Bitcoin is the truth is in the nuance. as you said, it's counterintuitive. It's counterintuitive that burning methane can be good for the environment. But then we dig that layer deeper and we find out, well, when it's burning methane that would have gone into the air and heated up the climate much faster, it's very good. Then we start to get it. And the other same thing is, well, that energy usage, because it's so flexible, it helps the build out of the grid by improving demand response and making them more profitable and causing them to get investment and taking headaches away from grid operators. We have to look at the nuances. And you just don't get those nuances in the mainstream media. There's very little investigative journalism that goes on anymore. And the other thing we have to factor in is that every technology, and I see this a lot in the sector I work in, every disruptive technology will get attacked by people who are going to get disrupted. When we had the internet, the existing print media didn't just roll over and say, that's wonderful, you're going to update us and we'll just quietly go about our business and take our retirement plans. No, they fought and they used every technique available to try and make out how bad how bad the internet would be for the environment. And so you use the levers available to you at the time. And so the lever that's being used right now is the narrative it's bad for the environment. And all it is it's the reactions and responses from people who have a vested interest in Bitcoin not succeeding, which is, of course, the people who are threatened with displacement, central bankers, and potential people who have their own altcoins that they want to succeed. And those are exactly the sources of where we find these narratives come from, who are making sure that that's the message people hear, as opposed to some deep thinking on the subject. So that's what's been occurring.
So you mentioned vested interests, and I'm really interested because what they tend to do, I mean, you've mentioned previously another term called greenwashing, and I'm really interested in understanding how we could better appeal to people who are environmentalists. How can we make that argument? Because from my experience, they don't even want to hear the argument. They've made up their mind. They're regurgitating, old arguments and almost kind of just antagonizing for the sake of, being against it. I don't know if it's whether or not they perceive that the people involved in Bitcoin are the people they're supposed to be against, or whether or not it's the ideology of Bitcoin, however that may be perceived as, or whether they genuinely believe that Bitcoin as a technology is destructive to the environment. So my question to you is, how do we appeal to people who are opposed on the environmental grounds? How do we appeal to them?
Yeah, it's important to be a bit of a psychologist here, at least an armchair psychologist, because there's this thing, and it's not just environmentalists, it's any group of people. Once you lock onto a position, then what humans tend to do is we tend to look for confirmation of our position. It's called confirmation bias. And so anything you hear, you will tend to hear it in terms of, so for example, if you go and talk to an environmentalist who's got a fixed position on this, then everything you say will be just justification of how self-interested you are and how desperate you are to see the flourishing of your asset class. And so it's important that we do a little bit of triage and we don't go in trying to change anyone because, well, you know how you respond when someone tries to change your behavior, probably the same way that anyone's going to. So the first thing is that you just want to have a conversation. You want to see if people can be curious. And if they're not, that's okay. Don't use your energy. Use and deploy your energy somewhere else. And so I would tend to say, look, I understand what you're saying. I completely understand why you would think it. In my case, I'd say, in fact, I used to think it myself. This is an area that I've looked into quite deeply, and I have some things that I'm happy to share with you if you're open to it. And then I'll just pause and see what they say. And they say, okay, let's hear what you say then. And then I just go through it quite plainly. So I think the second thing is to pause and to just give people a chance to declare whether they're open to hearing some new information or not. Not to try to change their minds, but just to at least give them some facts that they will not have encountered through the mainstream media. And then I'll give you an actual case. We met with one of the wholesale investors in our fund, and we were chatting about the next fund and everything was going very well until he asked me what I was doing. And I said, well, I'm doing some research on Bitcoin mining. And immediately his entire body language changed, and he stiffened and he folded his arms and he says, what? I thought you were a climate tech fund. And I said, well, sounds like you've got some views on Bitcoin mining already. What are they? And I just encouraged him to talk. And I said, well, there's a few things you've said that I have a perspective on. Would you like to hear my perspective? And he said, yeah. And I just went in one after the other. And he had, in his cases, really four misconceptions. The first misconception he had was that, hey, this is all very well that Bitcoin could conceivably, in theory, help with load balance in the grid, but it's not happening in reality. And I said, well, actually, it is happening in reality. And I used a Texas example. Okay, then number two, but its energy usage is still insane. And I said, yeah, well, actually, most of that energy today is coming from wasted sources of energy. It's helping to build out the renewable grid. Plus, also, you've got to remember that most of that energy is actually renewable right now. That's having an effect in inspiring other industries that they could use such a high renewable percentage themselves. Plus, every industry uses a lot of energy, wouldn't you say? So we have to look at the benefit as well. And you say, well, what is the benefit then? And I talked him through some of the benefits. 20 minutes later, he was asking if our next fund was going to be a Bitcoin mining fund. And so this is a recipe that I use that anyone can use. And it's really, I think there's two facets to it. Number one, don't try and change people's points of view. Just be curious and see if they're curious. The second thing is don't antagonize. Don't waste your time getting into debates. Have conversations with people, not debates. Debates are a waste of energy, and you just lock horns and no one gets interested in listening to each other, and it just becomes a useless exercise. I mean, maybe you enjoy it, but I don't. I see it as a waste of time. So I'm only interested, if I'm going to open my mouth and say something, I'm only interested in using that energy if it's going to be likely to hit a target, which is someone who is open-minded enough to actually listen. And if they're not going to listen, then I won't waste, but I'll respectively work out whether they're interested in listening. And then the third thing is, just to calmly mention some points, invite a perspective, and be curious enough to listen to them and hear them out in their position and have empathy with it. So, look, if we can do this more and more, we absolutely can. Will this work for everyone? Of course not. Some people have already made up their minds, and so don't waste your energy on those people. But there'll be a lot of people in the middle, maybe 50% of people, including 50% of environmentalists, who are open-minded, who will be curious, and would not like to think that they were actually attacking something that was the source of the solution, because that's actually scoring an own goal for the environment. And I think there'll be a lot of environmentalists in years to come who will realize, oh my goodness, I was busy attacking something that was part of the solution. How could have I been so foolish? And so we don't want people to wake up to that reality. We want to help people to realize that right now. And so I always attempt to be of service and to help people to not wake up and think that they were actually fighting against something they should have been supporting.
I think what I'm looking for essentially. I thank you for that. I think that's really, really useful and helpful in having those conversations with people. When I'm looking at a constituency like environmentalists or the people on the political left, is what is that thin edge of the wedge before we can sort of push these ideas into the greater body of that sort of constituency? Where do we start?
Yeah, I think it's also important to talk about the use of Bitcoin, because one of the objections is, and again, it's founded on a lack of information and ironically on Western privilege. Probably not a great idea to
Well,
accuse
that's
someone of that
something that
off the bat.
that's something the political left is very receptive to, actually.
Yeah,
That
exactly.
angle of,
So there's some
yeah.
great cases. So, for example, we've just got a socialist elected in Colombia who's come out and said he's in support of Bitcoin. We've had an oppressed nation of the Central African Republic who have basically been subject to continual colonization, post-colonization in the form of financial colonization from the franc, and all of the economic lack of sovereignty that has given them. And so we can see many cases where basically it's the developing nations, it's not the rich Western nations who are benefiting, who are adopting Bitcoin the fastest. So all the facts actually point to this being fantastic as a tool for the empowerment of the disenfranchised, of minorities, of people who are oppressed, who are discriminated against for political reasons, for their gender, for their position in society. And Bitcoin is, this again is not theory. These are real people, real cases happening not as anecdotally, but en masse, or war refugees from Ukraine who, en masse, hundreds of thousands of them, who were able to set up their lives again financially because they had exposure to Bitcoin, where their assets got frozen. They couldn't get them out of the country. They couldn't get their gold out of the country. They would have got lost through bribery pretty fast. So there's so many cases we can point to. This is not conjecture. This is facts that are right in front of us in increasing amounts that we can just open people's eyes to, should they be open to it, that actually support there is incredible social good that Bitcoin is doing right now.
Yeah, it's really interesting because on the one hand, the political left, I know a lot of the arguments, anti-colonialism and interference and all the rest of that. And then when it comes to Bitcoin and El Salvador and Central African Republic adopting Bitcoin, the arguments deny these countries their own agency and make the assumption that, oh, they've been hoodwinked into somehow adopting into a Ponzi scheme. So it's really interesting, the hypocrisy and the sand.
Well,
that
I can understand the why
arguments.
people would think that as well. And again, that's why it's important to do the digging and to do the investigative research for yourself. And there's been some great examples. Peter McCormack's gone into El Salvador and talked to real people on the streets who were talking about examples of how they used to have to go into the city to pay an electricity bill, get on a bus, queue for an hour, come back another 2 hours. The whole process would take half a day just to pay an electricity invoice they can now pay by Bitcoin. Or another family who was getting remittance, getting payments from the US from some relative of $100 a month, and $20 of it was being taken by the Western Union every month just in remittance payments, and now they get all of that money, which is the difference between them being able to live with some form of oversupply rather than undersupply. And it's making massive differences to these people's lives. And these are the real stories. So you can kind of deny at a theoretical level the arguments about how Bitcoin is good or bad for the people, but when you actually start to see these documentaries being made and this investigative journalism being done, talking to actual people with real problems that Bitcoin has solved and made their lives better, then to be against Bitcoin is actually to be against the very people you claim to support.
Yeah, I agree. I agree entirely, and I think the more we explain these use cases, and we haven't even gone into the social good that you just touched upon. Saving somebody 2-3 hours each way trip just to pay a bill or to receive $100 for that month, and then losing so much of it in commissions to intermediaries who add very little value. And we haven't even discussed the millions of
We
people
haven't even
who are
discussed
unbanked.
hyperinflation and how
Yeah,
the quantitative easing is basically the biggest asset transfer from the poor to the rich ever invented, and
yeah.
how without Bitcoin that will just continue, and that has continued, and it has resulted in so much wealth disparity and the increasing of the wealth gap. And that's what Bitcoin stops. It's not possible when you have a fixed money supply. So the social good aspect it's the ideal technology that's going to create a lot of the problems at a social level that have been created off the back of a non-fixed supply money system, which is corruptible and which can be weaponized and which is not apolitical.
Yeah. I mean, we could do an entire Spaces session just on
That's another session
social
in
good and
itself.
utility. Absolutely, and I hope to do that. I mean, we've been having discussions in the background around that as well. Daniel, you've done such a magnificent job today again, and if you want to just tell people, you've also got an article coming out later this week or next week, is it?
Yeah, I think it's coming out later this week. There'll be something in Bitcoin Magazine. I won't say what it is. I'll let
Okay.
them
All right.
come out with
Sorry. I didn't
come
mean
out
to
with.
let the cat out of the bag, but I just wanted to
But
give
that's all
people
right.
a heads up.
We could have a bit of a what do you call it, teaser trailer. But yeah, you can look out for something coming out later this week. So that should be a bit of fun.
Yeah, Daniel, thanks again. Look, we've just finished 1 hour of this discussion. Do you still have some time to perhaps take some questions? I'm not sure if we've got anyone,
Yeah,
but
sure.
I'll open that up. So if you want to ask Daniel a question, just request to come up on stage, and I'll let you up now. We've got Anuj. Anuj has requested since the beginning, so I'm not sure if that's just a reflex or whether or not he actually has a question. So I've got Rajwinder now. I will add Rajwinder, and if you just want to unmute your mic and go ahead, we're ready for your question or comment. Hi, Rajwinder, go ahead.
Hi, thanks for having me. Daniel, that was actually a really good discussion, and I'm really happy that you are doing this. And it was better than anything I've heard from any single person on this topic. And your comments about being a little bit of a psychologist are totally on point, because I've long said that once you have an opinion, then pretty soon your opinion has you. And it's a difficult thing to overcome because people look for confirmation bias. But I think your techniques are good. I had a specific question about pumped hydro battery technology. I saw recently some news item about China putting, having a target, a goal of 120 gigawatts by 2030, I believe. And that comes to about 0.003% of their electricity output per year. Is that a serious avenue of battery technology for power systems?
What sort of battery technology did you say?
Pumped hydro, in which they basically use the...
Pump hydro, yes. So you're using heated water and you're using that as a store of energy, you mean?
They basically pump the water to a height, a reservoir up there, and then...
Oh, got it. Yeah, look, that is legitimate. So that's not going to be applicable in all situations. So what that means, and that's a really smart idea. So if you have a hydro station and you have more water than can be used because you've had some heavy rains or whatever, but you don't have demand for that power, then again, that gets curtailed, it gets wasted. So what you can do is you can actually generate energy and use that energy to pump that water back up to the top of your dam again. So that's part of the solution. It's a small part because in most cases, hydro is, I think it's 10% of the world's grids is hydro. So it's only a solution for 10%. And also there's some interesting issues around where you can and where you can't do it. You need to have a certain dispatch area at the bottom of your dam so that you can utilize that technology. Sometimes you need to do some more digging, some more escalation. Sometimes it's already good to go. But yeah, look, there's a whole lot of smart solutions coming out. That's why I say it's not only going to be Bitcoin mining, it's also battery. What I'm seeing, though, is that Bitcoin mining is something that can be used anywhere. So it's technology agnostic. It's not something you can only deploy for hydro. You can use it for any source of energy that's on the grid whatsoever. And increasingly, those are becoming renewable. So I think it'll be a component of the solution, but maybe somewhere in China, which has so much hydro, they'll be using it more. Relative to the rest of the world, though, as I say, only 10% of the grid's hydro. So it'll be part of the solution, but not a huge amount.
Okay, thank you, Rajwinder. Anuj, are you ready to ask your question?
Thanks, Archie. That's great session, Daniel. I'm also doing some sort of research on this clean energy usage in crypto mining, and it's been more than 1 year. And great findings from your end. So my question is like, how do you see that organization and like Bitcoin Mining Council and the way Canadian-based blockchain and crypto mining firms are using clean energy, and despite doing that, we have seen a lot of criticism coming from the U.S. senator and some of the political folks. So, what's your take on that? Like, if we compare the crypto mining and usage of the clean energy in that is more than like 0.5%. I would say that almost 2 by 3 of the mining operations are happening using the clean energy or renewable energy. So if you compare to the mainstream ecosystem, they are still very behind if you compare to crypto mining firms using clean energy. So what's your take on this argument, and what's your take on the Bitcoin mining council working?
So why aren't more US senators coming out in favor of Bitcoin based on how good it is for the environment relative to standard technologies, you mean? Is that the question?
No. So my question is that if we compare the Bitcoin mining operations and the mainstream companies, right, using uh, oil or coal-based energy or some sort of like again, they are not using renewable energy as much as the crypto
Oh,
miners
sure.
are
So,
using.
okay.
Yeah, the
Okay. So,
argument, the
got it.
argument is coming from the political and the other environmentalists is not like some sort of syncing well with the data, right? So my
Yeah.
question is like, what do you see that what should the Bitcoin mining council can do in this segment, providing data and or auditing whatever the crypto miners are using as energy?
Yeah. Yeah. I think that the Bitcoin Mining Council is really doing a fantastic job because before them, we had no way of coming up with some definitive answers to the questions such as how much of Bitcoin mining is renewable. And now they have more than 50% of the hash rate of the entire world is part of the Bitcoin Mining Council. So they can start to get some very accurate statistics about what percentage is renewable. And they even have a skew factor, mathematical skew factor, allowing for the fact that there may be a heavier weighting of people who are not part of the Bitcoin Mining Council using fossil fuel. So they allow for these things. It's a very objective, very transparent measure they're using. So where they're focused on energy consumption. So it's not their business to be doing some of the work that other people are doing, myself included, to be looking at how it builds out the renewable case or how it's good for methane reduction from our atmosphere. I'd call that the proactive story, or that's like the asset story of how Bitcoin is good for the environment. What they're doing predominantly is saying, actually, when we look at energy consumption, most of it's coming from wasted energy. Most of it's coming from renewable. The percentage which is renewable has increased by 58% over the last year, and there is no industry in the world that is accelerating at that rate. And increasingly, it's using more and more wasted energy. And so these are incredibly important arguments for people to understand. They're based with some very sound research methodologies, and is starting to get traction. So I think more and more these messages will start to get. Now, whether the mainstream news media wants to use this or not, that's quite another matter. Whether senators pick that up or not, that's another matter.
Okay, Anush, thank you very much.
Thank you, Archie. Thank you.
Thank you. Bitcoin Sapiens, go ahead, unmute your mic, and we are ready for you.
Oh no, just listening on this topic. Yeah.
Alrighty then. Thanks for requesting and just listening then. Look, I think we are just about through all of our requests. So, Daniel, I just want to take this opportunity to say thank you so much for coming on my spaces again. You've done a fantastic job, and just looking at my screen, I can assure you that I have recorded this session and I will post it to my
I can see the
YouTube.
flashing red light right next to your own flashing 2 red eyes. So that's reassuring.
I'm glad I'm not the only person. You've done a fantastic job to make the environmental case for Bitcoin, and I can't wait to share this with everybody else.
Yeah, it's been fun, and thanks for the opportunity.
Oh, you're welcome on anytime. Thanks, mate. And so with that, I want to thank you all for tuning in, and my guest, Daniel, as well. Thanks, guys. Until next time.